Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm Taylor Grable, Director of the MIT Security Studies Program. I'm delighted today to welcome Michael Horowitz, who's the Richard Perry Professor from the University of Pennsylvania. He's going to speak to us on how dangerous are autonomous nuclear systems. Hopefully not too dangerous, but that's the conclusion, but we'll see.
Really starting already?
Yeah. Keep it down there, riffraff in the back.
Sitting back there like a grad student.
Like a grad student, you can't sit in the front, like a hybrid, like a professor that he is. So Mike is also director of Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania, which is it fair to say it's sort of Penn's main center for international studies and affairs. Yeah, so really big responsibility. He has multiple jobs at the moment. Senior Fellow for Technology and Innovation at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, he was in the Biden administration, where he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Planning and Emerging Capabilities, and Director of the Emerging Capabilities Office. That's a very long title. He's the author of many books, including The Diffusion of Military Power by Princeton University Press, and the co-author of Why Leaders Fight. He won the Carl Deutsch Award given by the International Studies Association for early career contributions to the field of international relations and peace research. Mike, it's really great to have you with us today. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Taylor. That makes me sound so much more distinguished than what you're about to hear today. So let's just keep expectations extremely low. And what I want to do today is talk about some ongoing research that I've been doing at the intersection of emerging technologies and nuclear weapons that in some ways picks up on a bit of work that I was doing prior to entering the Biden administration, and jokes aside, working very well with Vipin on a near daily basis, but now informed in some ways by that experience. So if we think about questions of coercion and power in international relations, and the broad debate that you see now about the incorporation of AI into nuclear command and control. Now, a lot of this debate, as I think many of you probably know, and for those that don't, I'm sure if you start thinking hey, nuclear weapons plus algorithms, that sounds really dangerous. The answer is that people freak out about this a lot. I tend to be much more sanguine on a bunch of these risk questions than many folks, for reasons that we can talk about if folks want to get into. But what I'm going to do today is present to you kind of work from two different papers that look at these two questions. The first is whether nuclear threats implemented with automated nuclear launch systems, or sort of AI-enabled nuclear launch systems, more credible compared to those implemented with those that have more traditional systems, essentially of delivering not just not necessarily threat delivery, but of making launch decisions where a human is in full control the entire time. The second is what states might actually do that. What kinds of states would we imagine should be the most likely to make an active decision to automate critical parts of nuclear command and control? That is different, just to be clear, from if you're worried about the robots crazy go nuts and take over the nuclear weapons, which would be a mistake. This would be when one might say it's deliberately make the decision to delegate more decision making to the robots when it comes to decisions surrounding nuclear weapons. For the first question, we did pre-registered survey experiments on the public in the UK and a small UK Parliament sample. This is work with Josh Schwartz at Carnegie Mellon that shows actually there are some advantages to automated nuclear threats. That if you can hands tie and throw the steering wheel out the window, it increases the perception of the credibility of your threat and the probability that people are willing to back down in the face of threats, which is, just to be clear, not to normatively endorse that, as a good thing for U.S. nuclear strategy in any way, shape, or form, or to say that I think any state should frankly do that. Because if reviewer 2 for this paper is out there, I just want you to know I understand that it's not like I'm not morally endorsing this. I'm just saying these are the results from the surveys. And then the second is that I think that the logic of automation is strongest for states that feel more insecure about their second strike capabilities. That to the extent that if what you are worried about in the context of modern warfare, and especially like war at machine speed, is being decapitated, those are the kinds of states that should be most likely to try to speed up their decision cycle when it comes to using nuclear weapons. It should be more likely to automate in theory, which means that, say, a military like the United States would thus be a lot less likely to do it, whereas maybe some like smaller nuclear powers would then be like more likely to do it. Although I'll then explain why my own undergraduate advisor, Dan Ryder, would disagree with that in some ways. All right, so here's the roadmap. We did the introduction. We're going to talk about nuclear coercion and artificial intelligence. This is sort of that question 1 that I laid out surrounding the credibility of threats with automated versus non-automated nuclear systems. We'll go through the theory, the research design, and the results from that. And then we'll talk about that second question, who might make decisions to automate nuclear launch, and then wrap up. So we can start here with the Soviet dead hand in perimeter. I'm sure like many people in the room are like familiar with this. Will not go like too far down the rabbit hole, though I guess I can if people want to. Thanks, Vipin. I figured, but like the idea that at the end of the Cold War, he just like shook his head, like verbal cues. That at the end of the Cold War, the Soviets had developed this like system whereby whereby they could essentially pre-delegate launch such that even if Moscow was decapitated, you could still like use they still had the ability to launch a retaliatory strike. Like how exactly the system worked and the details are not important in this context. The point is that it is, I think, widely believed that this system existed. And that it represented obviously like a not artificial intelligence system. It was like balloons and like delegation down to kernels. But that like this was that this would potentially, like afterwards, people have thought that this was potentially a credible system. The Soviets, now Russians, are the country that's probably been most in the headlines for this kind of thing today. Here we have Russians have a program that was originally called Status 6 that's now described as Poseidon, which is this uncrewed underwater vehicle that would be both nuclear powered and armed with a nuclear weapon that in theory could be just like out there if it was ever like actually built and deployed in a way that could, frankly, could be remotely piloted and thus would raise some different questions than the one that we'll talk about, some of the ones that we'll talk about today. But where the idea would be that you could have an AI-enabled version of this that was then able to operate and deliver a strike even if something happened to Soviet nuclear forces. Now, what exactly the difference is between this and say like an SSBN with independent like orders about what to do? Great question, but like people get very agitated about this and like some of the risks surrounding it. So this is like an issue that people pay attention to in international politics. Another issue that people pay attention to, more in the obviously these are two academic books, like more in the academic corners of international politics than in the policy world, is this question of whether nuclear weapons are useful for coercion. Lots of different people have written about this. Two, just to lay out, you have sort of the Sexer and Furman book expressing skepticism about the idea that nuclear weapons are useful for anything but deterrence, because, like, among other things, they're not essentially credible for offensive coercive purposes. On the other side, you have somebody like Matt Furman that's like, more nuclear weapons equals more power equals more coercion. Like essentially, like I'm oversimplifying the arguments, but the point being that this has been, there's been a persistent debate about this, frankly, like since nuclear weapons were invented, and certainly in the context of international relations literature. So if we start from that point, that there's a debate about the utility of nuclear weapons for deterrence and potentially for coercion, like what does AI have to do with this? So this gets to the question of why militaries might want to incorporate artificial intelligence into different use cases in the first place. And now, obviously, the utility of AI for militaries will vary depending on the use case, in some cases quite dramatically. But the reasons that you see out there include things like speed of operations or decision making, precision. For example, if you have an algorithm doing targeting that doesn't get tired and doesn't get angry, it's less likely then potentially to make mistakes. That bandwidth hacking, what I mean by that is if you think about all the drones that Russia and Ukraine throw at each other all the time, and the way that the prominence of electronic warfare in disrupting those systems and taking them out of the sky, a solve for that is if there is no data link to jam or disrupt. And so you've seen a lot more experimentation by Russia and Ukraine with edge, essentially very small amounts of edge compute to try to get around the electronic warfare issue and not have a data link to jam in the first place. You also have cases where militaries have talked about using AI for decision support. This is varieties of everything from like plug Clausewitz and Sunza into an LLM, like train an LLM on Clausewitz and Sunza, then like it gives you advice. I'm like relatively skeptical of that as like an upside for military decision makers, but there's like a lot of interest in these kinds of things, and there's like opportunities like in like offshoots of this vein surrounding wargaming and other kinds of things. I would tell a joke about Eric Lynn Greenberg, but he's not here. All right, so in addition to that debate about nuclear coercion, you also have then a debate about the impact of AI and strategic stability. We have two Washington Quarterly articles here arguing. I mean, nobody really argues for like the AI is like great for strategic stability, like side of it. This is like about as like close as you get. This article that Jessica and Heather wrote, where you see like arguments about how maybe AI enhances early warning. You could detect something. You could detect something faster. That you could detect errors or cyber vulnerabilities in your own system potentially better. Or that these systems might be more credible in some ways, which is what we're about to explore empirically. Many more people make this argument on the other side. James Johnson, I think, has like a cottage industry of like half a dozen articles in 2 books, making the argument that essentially like algorithms don't work as well as people think they are, and like thus there are great amounts of nuclear danger from the brittleness of algorithms, automation bias, which is when you treat an algorithm as more accurate than it actually is. Like you take something that is right 60% of the time and you cognitively offload to it and treat it as if it is 90% accurate. The consequences of errors at machine speed, like if you've ever, like the flash crash of war kind of concern that like former OpenAI researcher like Miles Brundage is like talked about a bunch. Risk of algorithms getting hacked, data poisoning, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this whole genre then of literature arguing that like it'd be super dangerous to incorporate AI into varieties of aspects of nuclear command and control, because like there's like things could go wrong, and thus it will increase the probability of miscalculation or an accidental nuclear war. All right. So if we have this debate about nuclear coercion, and we have this debate about, debate as it were, about AI and nuclear weapons. One way to think about this is in the context of nuclear threats, and like a classic shelling, like game of chicken kind of situation where the question is what kinds of threats are credible. One way to think about this would be in the context of like the threat that leaves something to chance. Like the whole like notion that you are leaving something to chance on purpose. But the reason why the threat that leaves something to chance works is because you are placing decision-making pressure on the other side. You are saying things might get out of control if you do something. I can't guarantee. Well, oh no, what if something were to happen to your house? the threat that leaves something to chance, thus being important in this context. What's more important for our concerns today is hands tying. The idea that it is very difficult in some ways for leaders to actually throw the steering wheel out of the car. Like in the classic game of chicken, where you throw the steering wheel out of the car to like demonstrate your credibility, and your opponent sees that and thus swerves, and so you win. The challenge is that in like real international politics, it's hard to actually do that effectively. And I'll talk much later in this about how leaders actually like don't really want to do that most of the time, which is why hopefully some of the things that we're going to talk about, like you never actually like observe in the real world. But so if that's a way to like think about nuclear brinksmanship, then you can imagine what you would get from automating nuclear systems. So we can think about automating nuclear systems in this context as creating a system of nuclear launch that is totally controlled, that like after activated by a human is totally controlled by a machine. So the machine is making the, I hesitate to use the word decision, the machine is implementing the sort of like will of its programmers, and there's no opportunity for the human to intervene or do anything to turn it off. So if the human says like, if you do this, the like nuclear weapons, if you do this, the nuclear weapons will launch, there's no opportunity to stop that. Like it would definitively happen. And so we then derive in this paper a couple of different hypotheses from this. Like one about the credibility of these threats, arguing that these threats should be more credible because like if you conditional on believing that somebody has automated their nuclear launch system and they've actually thrown the steering wheel like out of the car, then like almost by definition, that should be a more credible threat. And like a corollary to that would thus be that if you find your adversary's threats more credible, in some percentage of those cases, you would thus be more likely to back down. So we have a threat credibility hypothesis and a threat effectiveness hypothesis. Of course, this generates like an external validity question surrounding like how would you actually signal this credibly that like you had thrown the steering wheel like out the window. Like pause on that. We'll come back to it a little bit later. Like the true answer is like we can't solve this in the context of this of this paper. But like states do their best to signal what their policies are, and they are sometimes believed and sometimes not, frankly. So there are also some additional hypotheses in like the full transparency surrounding like the pre-registration of the like paper that I'm talking about today. There are some like other hypotheses that I will spend less time talking about surrounding whether like automated nuclear threats increase threat perceptions of a country, make the targets of those threats more likely to want to increase military spending, whether they become less likely to support nuclear disarmament, and how they then view the risk of nuclear accidents. All right. So, but if those are the two main hypotheses, are like the ones that here, like this threat credibility idea and the threat effectiveness idea. So, how do we test this? We have 3 survey experiments across the 2 of the UK public, one of UK elites that lays out a scenario of a Russian invasion of Estonia in 2030, where you randomly vary for the respondents whether Russia issues an explicit nuclear threat to a potential intervener. So, Russia is the aggressor. The target is a third party, in this case, the UK. And in one case, Russia issues an explicit nuclear threat. I would say, let's say, done in the traditional way, and that like if you do this, I will launch the nuclear weapons. In the other case, it's if you do this, I have activated a system, and that system will launch the nuclear weapons. And I think that there's an argument that we go through in the paper for why we think that this is like a relatively hard test of the idea that an automated nuclear system would increase threat credibility, and that Putin has not followed through on the varieties of nuclear threats that he has made in the Ukraine context. Estonia is a NATO ally, so defense of them should be automatic or sort of like static for a NATO partner. and the UK, which is the subject of like we're going to talk about, has nuclear capabilities. So they should feel like more comfortable than if the like target of the threat was, I don't know, like Lithuania, or if the target of the threat even was like Poland, or something like that. So here's study number one. Just you can see like a little bit of the text, which is, Putin's made a threat that Russia will launch at least one nuclear weapon against NATO military civilian targets in the UK and other European countries at the first sign that NATO basically intervenes to stop Russia's invasion of Estonia. And so we have our two treatments here, our non-automated treatment, and then our automated treatment. And we ran this in September 2023 on 800 respondents from the UK. Now, if you're looking at this and you're looking at like this sentence, ultimately a computer rather than Putin would make the final decision whether or not to use nuclear weapons. And you're like, well, is the computer really making a decision? Like, how might that bias the results in some ways? The answer is like, we thought about that too, and thought that this frankly might bias toward a finding in our favor, because the way that this sentence was structured essentially made it sound like incredibly automatic. And so in study number two, which we also ran on the UK public, we dropped that sentence. So it's the same thing that I just showed you, but we dropped that to try to make this like more, it's closer to apples as we could. We tried to keep this language, by the way, as like tight as we could. If somebody has a better idea, I would love to hear how to do it. And then the third study looks like the second one, and that was on 117 UK MPs. And because we only had 117, we did that as a within subject design, where everybody in the first two, you either got one treatment or the other treatment. In the second one, in the third experiment, you got each MP got both of the treatments, but the order was randomized. Okay. So that's what we have. We have the survey experiment. We have these 3 survey experiments designed to test whether the public, UK public, and UK MPs view automated nuclear threats as more credible and as more effective. The answer is yes. Again, disturbingly to reviewer number 2 of this paper. In that you can see here a density plot, the probability that Russia will use nuclear weapons. You have a 12.3% difference between the view respondents and their view of the probability that Russia will use nuclear weapons in the non-automated condition versus the automated condition. You also can see the effect of the that difference in language that I showed you between study 1 and study 2 here. Note that the difference is still statistically significant, but the difference is basically cut in half as we change the wording to be I think more apples to apples in describing the automated and non-automated nuclear launch systems. But still, there's a substantial difference in that people think that the probability that Russia will use nuclear weapons goes up when that threat would be implemented by an automated nuclear system as opposed to Putin's judgment. All right. So what about, so if that was the threat credibility hypothesis, what about threat effectiveness? You see here something similar. So this going back to study 1, automated nuclear threat in red, non-automated nuclear threat in blue. And you see the percentage that this is opposition to violating Russia's red line. So, by that, how willing are you to back down, basically? Are you going to still, or are you going to, should the UK still support Estonia, or should the UK back down? And so you see here in the automated condition, the percentage of people that, strongly oppose standing up to Russia basically doubles. And you see, a lot of those people you can basically find here essentially in that people that somewhat supported still backing Estonia and bucking Russia, in the non-automated condition. In the automated condition, then you see this dramatic change. So we see support for both of these hypotheses.
Who's the last human in the loop to make a decision here? Is it the decision that NATO forces initiated an attack? Like who's the last? Because it seems like it's just offloading from Putin pressing the right button to somebody saying NATO.
So in both cases, Putin tells NATO, if you strike me, I will launch nuclear weapons at you. But in one case, Putin just says that. And in the other case, Putin says that and says that he has activated their automated nuclear response system. And so essentially, like, if an algorithm detects that a NATO attack has happened, Russia will automatically launch a nuclear weapon in response.
Well, there's a human there. I don't think it's in the algorithm. Maybe it's in the algorithm. The heuristics incorporated into the algorithm that decides what defines the beginning of an attack.
Sure. I mean, that would be just the algorithm would make that decision.
But there's humans programming that.
Sure. Absolutely.
Even if it's an LLM, which is a bad idea. But you chose the training data for that LLM. So it's just offloading. It's like there's an underlying question here where do you trust the algorithm designer or Putin to make the final decision, right?
Well,
is that
I think yes, and given that leaders often search for off-ramps to avoid escalation and are known to make threats and then back down, in a world where Putin still controls the probability of backing down, then Putin might issue that threat, but then decide not to follow through on it. He has taken that out of his hands in the automated scenario. And I'm asking you to presume that this works as described. There's certainly a conversation to be had. I mean, the whole, part of where we were starting in some ways was like the notion, like there are like errors and issues associated with, like, people worry about some of these kinds of options precisely because they worry about what the error rate of this would be. And like a 5% error rate of an LLM that like controlled nuclear launch would be like not great. Anyway, but does that make sense?
Yes. Also, you said you're sanguine about the use of algorithms. Will you at some point make a case?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
That'll be one.
I'm not sanguine about the use of algorithms. I'm sanguine about the risk of miscalculation and I'm generally more sanguine about the risk of inadvertent escalation because I tend to be more of a deterrence model person than a spiral model person for reasons that I will explain at the end. Okay, so here, by the way, in case you're curious, are the accident results. Remember, I mentioned that I didn't go in depth in it, but that accidents hypothesis and the idea that people's view of the probability of accident risk goes up a lot when the nuclear launch system is automated. All right, I will actually skip this in the interest of time and move on to the UK MP sample, which I think is more interesting. And then what we see here in some ways is like genuinely, and like the paper is very transparent about this, like a split result. And that you see here the way that support for violating Putin's red line, which means following through and defending Estonia, drops. It's still about 50%, but like drops substantially and in a statistically significant way in the exactly as you see in the public sample, sort of as predicted. We do not see, though, support the threat credibility. So this hypothesis 2, we do not actually see statistically significant support for hypothesis 1 in the UK MP sample, and that UK MPs did not view their view that Russia would use nuclear weapons did not substantially change. Yes, Vipin.
Am I interpreting that right? That even in the automated treatment, 65.2% of respondents are willing to absorb a nuclear strike, essentially, to violate Putin's red line?
They believe in it. I mean, yes. Now, like, do you think in the real world they would actually do that? Like,
just checking out. I'm just thinking about the sample.
I don't know. No, it's a sample of UK MPs. That's what they said.
do you get to ask them about what their thinking was, just out of curiosity?
We did not get to ask them. YouGov did not give us the space to ask them a lot about what they.
Counterforce cowboy here.
Just results.
Yeah. Okay, that's okay. Cool.
I don't believe I believe the difference. I don't. These seem high, but you don't see. But we don't see support for the first hypothesis here surrounding the credibility. Surrounding the credibility of the threat. Welcome question. Sort of thoughts on why you think that is. The one reason might be people's priors on MPs' priors on whether Putin would use nuclear weapons are relatively immovable. I think it's not because they're like very well informed about how nuclear command and control works, even for like a relatively expert sample. Yeah.
If this accurately represents reality, I think the big finding might be that that number is that high, the 65. That's like the terrifying.
So I'm going to suggest we let Mike finish his
Is it terrifying or does it show alliances work?
That way we can come back to it in the question and answer.
But no, I think it's a good question. I think different people might have different priors on whether that number is too high or not high enough. Frankly, depending on your like belief, like what your views on NATO and alliances. Like you may not believe that number, but I bet you wish it was higher. All right. All right. So let's move on to the second question for now. I can go back. I mean, we can talk about like robustness of the findings. I'm sure it'll come up in Q&A, which is what existing policy on AI and nuclear weapons looks like right now. The answer, in some ways, is that every country that is really articulated a clear policy on AI nuclear weapons has basically been like, we're not letting the killer robots launch the nuclear weapons. Just to be clear, for those of you that have read some of my other work and like more like policy focused work, I think often I'm associated with like a pro autonomous weapon system position, which is like basically true, except in this case where it's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. And so was delighted that the U.S. in the the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review officially came out against it. We saw this France and the UK. You have the Biden-Xi agreement in like November 2024 that all sort of commit to human control of nuclear weapons. Russia has not made a similar announcement at present. And one of the reasons, just to like, this has been a conversation that's been happening for a long time. One of the reasons why the 2022 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review statement was useful was that you'd had statements from U.S. military leaders for years, essentially like saying things kind of like that, hinting at it, but people didn't believe it in some ways. Although, frankly, like I continue to get questions from people, especially in the arms control community, about whether this was even really the policy of the United States in the Biden administration, or whether they were like secret nuclear weapons and a secret launch policy, where like we would let the killer robots launch the nuclear weapons. Like people just won't take yes for an answer sometimes. But the point being that the U.S. has been like very clearly against this, and U.S. military leaders have exactly very clearly against this. So park that in your brain for a second. There's also a lot of concern about the way the increasing rate of conventional war could place pressure on crisis stability. The idea that if you are fighting wars at machine speed and fighting conventional wars at machine speed, you could have compressed decision cycles. You can have immediate decision making taken out of the hands of more senior human commanders, and that this could create a risk of escalation, specifically because the fear of losing quickly could lead states to want to pre-delegate or do like all like launch on warning, like all the kind of like dangerous postures from the Cold War, then kind of come back on the table. In theory, if you're worried that you could lose so quickly and be decapitated so quickly because the war is being fought at machine speed, that you won't be able to like make an informed decision about how to respond. I think though that one of the things that we should be likely to see over time, and this gets to like do you believe the things that China says or something like that? This should potentially really, though, depend on how confident you are in your second strike capabilities. Because if you are confident in your second strike capabilities, then it doesn't matter how quickly the war is being fought. You can't be decapitated. Like, you could lose quickly or not quickly, and somebody could launch a decapitating strike against you quickly or not quickly. But if you have secure second strike nuclear capabilities, then the risk of decapitation obviously is extremely low, or potentially zero, to the extent that anything could be like probability zero. And so thus, why would you hand over control to the robots? Whereas if you are not secure in your second strike capabilities and you believe that you could be decapitated either because of something about the credibility of your forces or because of the way that you make decisions, then in theory you should be more likely then to automate your nuclear forces, which would mean then, say, like a country like North Korea, under this logic, would potentially be the greatest risk of this. A country that is conventionally inferior, that fears decapitation just as a matter of like on any random Wednesday, and is a repressive regime. So in theory, then this would suggest that a country like North Korea would be a lot more likely to automate its nuclear command and control than say a country like the United States. And I'm curious whether folks think that the logic here is correct or incorrect. So Dan Ryder, in a new book, then has I think introduced some really interesting variability into both of the questions that I've talked about. And that if any of you read Ryder's 1995 article Exploding the Powder Keg Myth, Ryder argued that preemptive wars basically never happen. But that was really a proxy for essentially a first strike, pun intended, on the spiral model of war. Arguing that essentially the causal mechanism through which the spiral model ends in war, which is this sort of like miscalculation, inadvertent escalation, like people are doing things, that basically that doesn't happen because leaders, most of all, seek control and develop off-ramps for themselves. And so Ryder in a new book is essentially attempted to show empirically that leaders, in fact, never actually tie their own hands. And they do not ever tie their own hands because they wish to maintain control and off-ramps. That has implications that if you believe Ryder is right, that then has implications for both of the kind of the arguments that I've laid out today. Because if Ryder is correct that leaders don't actually tie their own hands, then even if automated nuclear threats would increase threat credibility and increase the probability that somebody would back down, essentially, even if that could generate a higher probability of nuclear coercion, states won't do it because leaders don't want to remove that control for themselves. They wish to have off-ramps because they wish to control whether war happens or not and not leave that up to a machine. It influences the second question because it means that even if your nuclear weapons are more insecure, even if you have a legitimate fear of decapitation and that fear goes up, you would still wish to maintain control over the decisions surrounding nuclear launch in the moment, because you wouldn't want to offload that to an algorithm. You'd want to maintain control, as he argues happens empirically. But also, if he is correct, this is a reason to be actually more sanguine than the average piece of average article out there about the risks surrounding the intersection of AI and nuclear weapons. Because the reason why people argue often that there is risk has to do with issues surrounding algorithm, algorithm plus mistake equals higher probability of inadvertent escalation. If at the highest end of that, at the place where that goes to war, you actually don't see it because leaders are controlling the off-ramps and keeping more off-ramps available than people think that they do, then actually it's a reason to be, I think, a little more sanguine about some of those risks. All right, so to wrap up, I think advances in AI mean that some degree of AI integration into nuclear command and control is inevitable, if for no other reason than that AI will be integrated into all ISR by countries and already is. So the idea that there will be some firewall between our nuclear systems, will there be no AI in there, even as conventional militaries increasingly use AI across the enterprise, seems probably wrong. There's a large degree of fear about some of these low probability outcomes. And what I've shown you today are results from two papers, one of which presents experimental evidence showing that automating nuclear threats could increase threat credibility, whether you like it or not. And the second being that if what you are worried about is countries actually throwing the steering wheel out the window, the countries we should be worried about the most are countries with the least secure second strike capabilities, because countries with more secure second strike capabilities won't fear decapitation as much. Stop there. Happy to take your question.
Thank you.
All right, keep your hands up because this room is a little hard to see. Vipin, I saw you first, and everybody else, just hands up, please.
Mike, that was great. I generally,
But
I'm generally persuaded, right, that automaticity of response is more attractive to states with insecure second strike capabilities. And this goes back, all the way to shelling, tripwires, automaticity. And so my question is sort of, what is the AI part of this, right? So perimeter and dead hand was taking multiple phenomenology, including sort of what the, that there was a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union or Russia, and that Russia or the Soviet Union had not been able to respond or retaliate. And it was just a very simple logic chain, right? And it was the threat of automaticity that the Soviets or the Russians believed was necessary because they were actually not particularly confident in the security of their second strike. And I agree that today North Korea is probably the leading candidate for somebody implementing this.
I would if I were them.
I'm not sure so I'm curious, sort of, could you explain, there's the perimeter and dead hand weren't AI, right? And so what is AI add to the automaticity or dead hand piece of this? And what is, not, I guess, the machine part of it, but the intelligence part of it? Is there a world in which the more, I think, more troubling application of this would be in limited nuclear contexts, where you have sort of artificial intelligence actually going multiple rounds and optimizing what your response would be in managing escalation? I don't know if that's better or worse, but I can think of other applications. So I'm just curious, sort of, what the AI layer of this is.
Sure. I think it's a great point. I think to some extent the broadly what both of these in some ways are showing is that they're the logics of nuclear coercion and deterrence that we have had essentially since the Cold War are still applicable. And that the notion that somehow everything reinvents because of AI is probably wrong. And that AI in this case, in some ways, for the first question surrounding threat credibility, AI in some ways, I will tell you a story about why I can be different in a second, but AI in some ways, I think macro is the modern mechanism through which then you would implement more of a perimeter or dead hand kind of solution. It's not, but the core logic behind it is not necessarily different than that. Nor would the impact on credibility. The thing that AI is in theory doing for you in that situation that is different is the reliability of implementation, in that it reduces the number of steps involved in manifesting essentially from the way that dead hand would have worked, which maybe on the margins would influence, if you could credibly signal that on the margins, would increase the credibility of it. But macro, I totally believe what is behind the question in some ways that you are asking. And I think what this is suggesting is that a lot of the AI and nuclear genre is overstating the relative impact of the AI on the probability of nuclear escalation. Frankly, going even to this question of I would back out from what you just said about AI and escalation questions in limited nuclear context. If you were talking about something like an LLM, obviously it would depend on what the training data was and how you programmed it and what the risk propensities were. And there's this growing genre of AI decision support, of literature on AI decision support systems that's mostly queuing actually off of Israel Gaza kind of stuff. I think there's been wild misreporting in public about that, about some of the stuff Israel's done with AI, but that is not the point here. the challenges there, though, I think are, again, like less about the AI, or like much more prosaic. It's not about like essentially like the magic box of AI and the thing that it does. It's more about the way that you, like, what you want at the end of the day, and like any case of AI integration for militaries and decision support, is essentially calibration between like how good an algorithm is and how good the like people making the decisions think that it is, wherever they're making it, whoever's activating it and like making decisions on base that think that it is, which means that you have to solve like the risks of algorithm aversion when people undertrust algorithms, and you have to solve issues of automation bias where people overtrust algorithms, and that becomes like a really prosaic training issue, frankly, rather than like the AI like in and of itself.
Can you, I'm gonna insert myself here, but
Sure.
Can you deconstruct AI for a minute? I mean, it's this big thing. It's not clear. Like, it's about certain applications of certain kinds of technology, right? I mean, AI is sort of too big a category to say AI. I mean, and nuclear, you have to sort of say what,
Yeah.
like what. So, like, just based upon your experience, like, what do you see as the 3 or 4 kind of buckets or types of things that many people just call AI and sort of hand wave at it that you think should be treated, right, really as kind of distinct technologies or distinct approaches or distinct categories?
So in this context, I would say, like, I think about AI as a general purpose technology. And so like for those that, if you like follow the like AI discourse, like as it were, that puts me on like a particular, like where you have there's like artificial, there's like AI, there's super intelligence is coming like tomorrow and we need to worry about it. Or be excited about it, kind of like side of this conversation. And then there's more of a like AI is a general purpose technology, which means like the rules of who wins and loses when we have new technologies sort of still apply. I tend to be more on that side of it, which is like frankly like a very clear follow through from like my dissertation and first book, that I think like adoption and diffusion patterns matter. But like in this context, but since AI is a general purpose technology, what we're talking about are different algorithms applied for different use cases. In the like nuclear command and control context, I think you start with things like early warning, where you could incorporate AI into like detection, say, of whether a nuclear launch was happening. Like in a very simplistic sense, it's like somebody's eyeballs like looking for something versus like an algorithm doing pattern recognition. Say, you could at the like other end of the spectrum, you could imagine you could have like things like, say, like a Poseidon kind of system, where you have like an uncrewed vessel or system that could either launch nuclear weapons in and of itself, and is like using an algorithm to make a judgment over whether it's supposed to launch or not, as opposed to receiving like a specific launch order from a human operator. You use different kinds of data to train those algorithms. Like one is data about like whether missile attacks are happening. Another would be data more like to Vipin's question about what the targets are, and thus like how you would optimize striking targets. And then you could imagine sort of things in between, sort of like a decision support to help decision makers decide whether to use nuclear weapons in the first place. And that'd be based on a third set of training data. That would probably be about the like probability of escalation, or what the right choice for a country would be in a given kind of situation. Frankly, that'd be the hardest to do, like compared to the other two. And so I think it's the one we are like least likely to see effectively implemented. But essentially, like some of this is like based on natural language processing. Some of this is like based on vision algorithms. But you're absolutely right that you have, when we talk about this, and like if you want to get more into it, then the question becomes like, what's the specific algorithm? What's the data it's being trained on? And then what would be frankly, like your confidence that like one could do that thing?
Great, thanks. Eric, does it say genuine two finger?
It's a genuine.
All right.
So Mike, when you lay out those types of things that artificial intelligence could be used to do, I think about the Aegis combat weapon system that could basically do all of those 40 years ago, except it did it in a certain, like not in a probabilistic way, but like you meet these rules, then you fire the missile as long as you turn that system on. So what is different about large language models, if we think of as AI today in this conversation versus that technology that's existed for 40 or 50 years, is it that actually an AI decision model might not be as automatic as something that was a rule-based decision model?
Yeah, so if you think about the like progression of AI from like rule-based to like machine learning to like whatever we're going to call like the current transformer era, which is still like obviously like machine learning like based in a lot of different ways. Like I think you're absolutely right. Like when I have like more like policy or academic conversations more on the conventional sort of side of this, I point to Aegis and CWIS to like make the argument that in some ways like the US military and frankly 40 other countries, if we're talking about CWIS, have deployed an autonomous weapon system for 40 years, and those systems have been actively used in combat effectively. And people are generally like not terribly concerned about the, about like escalation risk, surrounding them. I think the differences in this case, one of them you already, I think, put your finger on, which is that you're talking about probabilistic algorithms rather than specific rule-based systems. The second is because those rule-based systems can only be used to do certain things because they are rule-based by definition. So if you think about the ability to use, so like the launch point in some ways is the thing that's most easily replicable with a rule-based system, which is why those are the autonomy instances you've seen on the battlefield for decades. Like if enough missiles are coming in that a human couldn't point and click at them, you can turn on the automatic mode, and the automatic mode is like, all right, like everything's a target, fire. That is harder to use a rule-based system to provide decision support, harder to provide a rule-based system even to do, hardest to do decision support, harder to do something like early warning detection, where there's not necessarily like a hard and fast rule about what you know, except probably when a human has already detected it. But yeah, it's a great question.
Two finger.
I wonder if the distinction between a probabilistic system and an if-then system is really as clear as you make it. Since if it's automated, doesn't the if-then system have to reach a probabilistic decision about whether the if factor has actually occurred?
I think it depends on how clear you think it depends on, I mean, you could, I guess, yes, if your rule-based system isn't very good, because if your rule-based system isn't very good, then it's sort of like making a judgment, and there would be uncertainty about like whether it should act. That implies that the signals that like the need for it to act has like maybe like hazard. You're not sure sort of whether it's been met or not. The way that these
Good. Right. What makes it good? Isn't that fundamentally a probabilistic decision that it's always been right or mostly been right in the past?
But that's why in some ways the use of these rule-based systems was pretty limited, because the number of cases in which you could confidently use them, because where the data essentially would be clear enough that it would not be viewed as probabilistic, was very small. And so that's why you see them used for things like ship defense and base defense and like those kind of things where like there's a clear and imminent threat and things coming in. And so it's obvious what to do. It's why you don't see, say, there are very few autonomous weapon systems like the Israel's Harpy. Here's a good example of this. Israel's Harpy was a loitering munition that was an autonomous weapon system. So essentially imagine like a rule-based algorithm designed to detect, imagine like the goal is to detect like whether something is a radar, say, like, or not. Israel actually, the problem was that because of the way that the rule-based system was set up, while the Harpy could loiter looking for a thing that was a legitimate target, it couldn't actually distinguish between things that were actually like valid targets from a law of war perspective, because like that radar might be on top of a school, or that radar might be, like on top of a hospital or something like that. And so thus, when Israel updated the Harpy, they actually made it non-autonomous. and turned it into a system called the Harap, which was a semi-autonomous system, because that had more human control than the Harpy, because they didn't think a rule-based system could execute that kind of operation for exactly the reasons you're suggesting.
Caitlin.
Thanks for this talk. I really appreciate your efforts to bring data to a topic that I find to be incredibly hard to study because of the dearth of nuclear incidents and how little we know about this technology.
It's like a double whammy of no
It's
evidence.
a really bad sell
Yeah,
of
yeah.
things to study. So
Totally.
I
100%.
really commend that.
No argument.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about what we should take away from your findings about what like, let's pretend states read your paper. And they say, okay, great, I'll automate my threats because it turns out that makes them a lot more credible if my arsenal's vulnerable. I guess I appreciated you kind of talking about the wider set of reasons why that might not happen, which maybe apply especially to like DPRK type states where leaders prefer centralized control. I guess I wanted to ask about another set of reasons that might make states hesitant to automate these types of threats, which is that if I am the state with a really insecure second strike capability, and I tell my, by definition, larger, asymmetrically more powerful nuclear opponent, hey, if you do X, I'm definitely going to use my tiny insecure arsenal to go after you. Doesn't that just pretty much guarantee preemption? Like, doesn't that take the thing you're afraid of, like getting counterforce, and just incentivize the opponent to say, okay, I'll definitely just be launching this counterforce strike when I also cross your red line? And the reason I'm asking this is because, again, thinking about like what the implications are, there's a potential increase in threat credibility or coercive capability, but aren't there also these other trade-offs? And should we be thinking about kind of how states may balance those? And is that maybe why a bunch of states have actually said, no, we're not doing this?
I think it's a great question. I think that you are probably right that would be an adverse consequence. Like the logic of why you might still do it. I mean, in some ways, you're trying to automate to deter being attacked, conditional on the conventional war. Then the probability of escalation arguably increases for the reasons that you've suggested. If somebody crosses your red line, which probably then depends on the extent to which you think that you can deter the attack, like in the first place through the threat. I think that the repressive regime question in some ways could go both ways in this context, and I will now provoke Taylor and see how he responds. And by that what I mean is there's a logic through which I think authoritarian leaders, and you've obviously written a lot about authoritarian militaries and their behavior, that might want more control in some ways than democratic leaders. And so, does that make them even more likely to sort of follow that like Reiter logic of never tying your hands, because like they want control anyways? But like the alternative is that those autocratic leaders like don't trust their people. If they trusted their people, they would have a different kind of political regime to begin with. And so the thing that like when I worry about something like why would a country like China say like automate, either in the nuclear case or frankly in the conventional military like context when it comes to the use of AI closer to the battlefield edge, it's precisely because there's at least a little bit of evidence that the PLA thinks about human machine teaming differently than the U.S. military does, and that the PLA and that especially as you get sort of like more senior people like thinking about it, that somebody like Xi might want control. And control means cutting as many people out of the loop as possible because he doesn't trust his people in the first place. And so thus the benefit of automation is like you get to decide when you turn it on, which means you don't have to rely on your people like following through on things that you said quite as much. Like you're like in political science terms, you're skinning down the selectorate. And like one of the really interesting things here is the way that at lower levels, the way that the Chinese military actually writes about human machine teaming is like at the tactical level looks almost exactly like the U.S. military. In some ways, like they like write about the like the same way about like empowering people and like low level decision making, and it's frankly like not all that different. But I think that there have been these concerns at the operational strategic level that the incentives to automate sort of might go up. I'm thinking of like Sam Bresnick's Foreign Affairs article and like some of those like kinds of things like on this. But so I think there are competing logics there basically like about authoritarian states that apply to the conventional realm as well.
needless to say, a rich opportunity to test some of these arguments
Yeah.
over time. Emily.
Yeah, I wonder on your survey results from the NP test, do you think that it could be the fact that Russia has made so many explicit threats that they cannot follow through on, that because your scenarios are relying on people taking Russia at its word, that they have tied their hands and automated the system with AI, that the respondents simply don't believe that that is in fact the case?
That's a good question. I think that is very reasonable. Like that, we pre-registered that we thought that we would see the same results for the UK public, and so we don't claim any differently, like in the paper itself. But in the results section of the paper where we explain, like, all right, like this looks different than like we hypothesized. Remember, kids, supposed to be honest about the work. We speculate that might be a reason. That in some ways the like persistence of like Russian nuclear threats in the Ukraine context and the failure to follow through might be one reason why the like needle isn't moving as much for like MPs who, even if they don't understand like the details surrounding nuclear command and control, are like more likely to be tracking Russian nuclear threats in general than members of the public.
Jim Walsh.
I really enjoyed the talk, and I really think it's neat how you made your sample MPs. I think that adds something to it, you know, rather than just random people in the street.
Well, I learned from Josh Kurtzer, so.
Very good. I want to pick up this thing about control and North Korea-like states. On the slide, and you refer to it, these are states that you expect to be repressive, right? So they're fighting for control. This is the group of states, right? They're repressive for a reason. And the leader wants control. And your argument that, yeah, they're control freaks, but this allows them to cut everyone else out of the process, that's true up until they give up all of the control. And you wonder about, is it the number of decision makers that have control that they're calculating, or is it having control? Because it goes from 100 to 0 after that point, or they give it over to a machine. And when you think about leaders, at least in the North Korean case, where, you know, they have tied, you know, they're monarchs, but they're also half deities, always giving guidance, always owning everything. Just doesn't seem like they're the type of people to do that. That doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. And that's good news if they don't, obviously, right? But I wonder if that's the way they look at it. That's the nature of the exclusivity calculation that they're doing. And just sneak it real quick. And if what happens if it fails the first time? Someone bluffs it, they get caught, then where are you? All right, ignore the second question.
We have a one-question rule.
Oh, okay.
Which is consistently violated.
I was about to say, it seems you felt very comfortable just like running through you there.
Maybe you should automate your guess.
Yeah, I know. That seems like a great use of automation.
I'm gonna have a taser which will go off automatically when the question begins.
I think that there's certainly some. I mean, look, like the truth is like we don't know. Like frankly the you know, like what in that second paper, which is where that second strike sort of argument comes from. It is a, you know, like a theoretically derived argument that is like frankly informed speculation more than like anything else we can possibly, than like anything we can, you know, like we can know for sure. I think the question then becomes, in some ways it's like related to the question that Caitlin asks, like how these different variables like add up. Like this second strike logic, I think, is pretty clear. I think the logic for why authoritarian leaders wish to cut unreliable people like out of the like chain of decision also would be also is pretty clear. It might also, I mean, it could also be the case like in a specific country like North Korea that, you know, maybe the like Kim regime feels like it has done so much work to, you know, be like godlike status that their like confidence in follow through is very high. I mean, I could offer you counterpoints like, you know, when they like, you know, fire like anti-aircraft artillery into family members to like signal their, you know, like that's like I love you so much that I tear you apart with artillery rounds. But which doesn't necessarily signal confidence in their amount of control, like in their degree of control. But it's not, but like we don't know for sure in this context. I do think that it depends. It does probably depend on the extent to like where a leader would want the point of control to be. And frankly, if Reiter is correct, then one could imagine a world where you would see, say, a country like North Korea implement that kind of automated nuclear system, but with an override, which would defeat the purpose from a credibility perspective. Obviously, if that was like public, precisely because they wish to like they are the god and so wish to like make the final decision themselves, like rather than offload it. And like frankly, there's a lot more in the like history of escalation to suggest that is the case. That that leaders will like wish to wish to maintain control, like just like they do in lots of other cases, because they wish to have off ramps. But frankly, if what you were worried about is escalation, that's a great news story then, because it means that there are many more off-roads to escalation than we commonly assume in something like the spiral model. That's basically how I think about that in this. How I think about that in this context. It sort of depends on like how these variables like balance out. Like I think that there is a logic for why you should see automaticity in this context. There are certainly reasons why states might. Even the states that seem most likely might choose not to.
Great. Barry Posen.
Since I didn't see the second paper, this question may be answered there. You used the term secure satisfied capability in a kind of a very general way. And I wonder if it matters if the concern of the potential target is about the survivability of their command and control versus the survivability of their weapons. Because I can imagine different combinations.
Yeah.
Of
I was about to say, tell me. What do you think? Yeah, what do you think?
Well, I may be a victim of my own biases, so I want to be careful here. But if I'm pretty sure my weapons survive, I'm not going to worry very much about my command and control. Right, especially if I'm at the low end of the scale, as you say, in terms of the kind of forces I produce. I'm basically a counter value, minimum deterrence sort of a person, or sort of a country, and it's really the other guy's problem. The other guy the attacker has to have really great confidence that not only is he going to wipe out my command and control, but he's going to keep it down such that it's not going to grow back, that nothing is going to, that there is no dead hand or no hand that looks dead, but then begins to spasm.
like Addams Family style? Like, yeah.
It's called the headless chicken problem back in the 50s and 60s. When we talked about this, it's called the headless chicken problem, right? The other guy has to worry about the headless chicken problem. Now, if on the other hand, right, you're concerned that your forces are gone, then maybe the command and control is not going to make you feel very good, and you're going to be much more concerned about getting the forces off early. So maybe that drives you to automaticity in your deterrent project. Imagine all my missiles basically stand up in a cornfield, right? They're just standing on pellets in a cornfield. That's my missile list, and that's my deterrent, right? Well, I want you to believe those missiles are going off pretty darn quick, like within 20 minutes or within 15 minutes, right? And I, as a human, may not be able to generate that, but if I slave a program to it and convince you that I've tweaked the parameters in such a way that essentially I have a hair trigger, right? Then maybe I'm driven in that direction, right? So I'm suggesting that maybe you want to think about, well, I'm not a big fourfold, matrix kind of a person the way I think, but both things,
right?
Both the command and control survives and the weapons survive. The weapons are not the command and control, not weapons, except it's stupid. And then whatever the other one, the slide I've already forgotten. But go through each one and sort of ask where do these incentives lie? Right? And I'm not sure the answer is always the same.
I love that. No, like that is great. Like that, and that actually makes a lot of sense to build in, and because I think that intuitively, I feel like you should be right that there's a difference between if your command and control is vulnerable versus if your weapons are vulnerable. But I would even add though a further layer to that, which is that I wonder if it matters whether you would die, and that the extent to which command and control, and this in some ways like gets back to some of the previous questions about what it might look like for authoritarian regimes. If command and control is centralized in you, then even if your forces could potentially survive, you still might view yourself as, you still might want to go on a hair trigger from a signaling perspective, because you don't really care actually if your forces survive if you don't survive. And so the like logic ends up like netting out in a similar way. But that's certainly, but I think that there's definitely a logic. I think that there's definitely a logic there. And I think you're right that the strongest incentives, or at least intuitively, I think you're right that the strongest incentives to automate would be, or like go on a hair trigger, frankly, whether it's AI enabled or not, would be the like more insecure your forces are, which probably means like there's not a triad, and more like tells in a cornfield than than anything else. I'm not sure I'm convinced that you would be more copacetic if command and control would be more destroyed, but your forces would survive. But I need to think about it a little more. It's a really good point.
I think it's arguable
Yeah.
that the dangers you pose in your retaliation, in the threat retaliation against an adversary, are higher if your command and control is bad. Because your adversary can't count on you bargaining in good faith, can't count on you bargaining in some discriminative way. So, in a weird way, I think it may build more automaticity into some kind of response, even if it's not a massive response. And so I think spinning out the logic of, sort of crummy command and control and its influence on deterrence, I don't think that's a done deal in our business.
I really that's great homework. No, I appreciate that.
Excellent. So somehow my list is not getting any shorter, even though people keep asking.
I'll give a shorter answer.
No. So I'm gonna put a moratorium on two fingers, so we can try to get through the list as much as possible. So my apologies to some of you. And we're gonna enter the speed dating round, where I'm gonna call in two people and then turn it back to you.
Cool.
And they're gonna ask really sharp, quick, pointed questions. So Mariana and Rich, you are the first.
Is that sharp, smart, or sharp like spear?
Oh,
Yeah.
All of the above, yes.
Thank you, Michael, for this presentation. I'd like to build on what Barry was saying. So what I'm hearing through this discussion, there's probably three factors that might be conducive to make a country more likely to automate. When they feel their command and control is insecure, which I think, or they fear decapitation, which what I understand was the primary reason behind the perimeter. Not the insecure second strike. I mean, it was introduced when the Soviet Union had pretty much very secure second strike, but for some reason, so it's fear decapitation. And for that, they want to build a decision-making time, right? You also talked about perimeter past tense. My understanding is it's still in operation, some kind of version of it, so I might be wrong. Another factor is, I'm sure, insecure second strike, smaller nuclear forces, North Korea. And then the third one is kind of the authoritarian, the regime type, right? Now, again, that could apply to North Korea, but certainly not to the Soviet Union, where I have 3 launch control authorization units, the Chechens. That was 2 more than the United States had at the time. And the reason was that Brezhnev at the time was so senile that they were afraid he couldn't key in the code. So Minister of Defense and the Chief of General Staff had kind of replicate units. So not sort of all authoritarian regimes might be built differently. It sounds like North Korea might check all of these boxes, and that's why it's more likely to automate. But I'm just wondering what you think about kind of unconflating those factors.
Hold your thought, Rich.
I'm not sure if I'm sharp now, but I hope I'm reviewing too someday. Your paper made me think about if I were trying to increase the credibility of my threats, given your results, I wouldn't actually automate, but I would feign automation to try to capture the public opinion and MP results from the first half, and yet try to retain control from the second half. But then I started worrying about a Sagan-style story where feigned automation has some gray area where it spills over into real. So you don't automate the nuclear system, but you automate something that flies the nuclear system around, and then you end up in like you load the wrong warhead, or the plane breaks up in flight, these types of things. And the automation contributes somehow, and that's where the accidental escalation occurs.
Great. Back to you.
Those are both great. I think that you're right in laying out that those as like three logics for why countries might automate, excluding to Caitlin's point, if they like happen to read the first paper and then be like, yeah, I really want to automate to like increase nuclear coercion. In that, like, there's this decapitation logic, there's the forces logic, and then a potential regime type logic. And point taken on perimeter, no argument with you at all. That's my bad in the way that I was like talking about. Like the paper is clearer than like I was in the presentation. I think that you're like based on things we know in other parts of political science, you almost have to be right about different authoritarian regimes behaving differently. And that the like logic of the argument I've laid out, I think would apply more the more personalistic your regime is. And so like thus in some ways like North Korea is the easiest one for me to like put in that paper actually talks about this a little bit, like that the more, North Korea in some ways is what could in theory be the clearest case, because it's the most personalist. It's also why I would worry then about like a Xi regime more than prior Chinese regimes, because you have like in some ways like as China's become more personalistic, that would thus put them at higher risk along the if you believe the like macro argument that I've laid out. But it's certainly true that in more competitive authoritarian regimes, and certainly regimes where you might have more contested power between military and civilian leaders, that you should see that the like logic wouldn't apply like as clearly in that context, or might apply differently, or like in a third way. I need to like think about exactly how that might lay out. Like I have not thought about this in a way that generated point predictions about different types of authoritarian regimes, and so I won't pretend that I have. But no, it's a great point. And some element of that has to be true, basically, from like other research like out there. To Rich's question, I feel like to me, this depends on who is trying to feign automation. Like we would be terrible at it, because like we are terrible at keeping all secrets, basically. And so like the idea that we would develop like a fake, like a super effective, like fake nuclear posture, like that. And like I like, all right.
I've been doing it for 7 years.
That everybody agreed was fake. There's a difference between deceiving yourself and
All of the folks who've been in government do that.
there's a difference between deceiving yourself and like a coordinated deception campaign. I think
But the states most likely to do it, the personalist dictators are
the
probably the most likely.
probably the most likely to actually follow, or the most likely to actually follow through with it. In theory, those states might be better at keeping secrets, maybe be easier for them to feign. And so like the optimal strategy is to keep the override switch, but not reveal it in sort of any way, shape, in any way, shape, or form. I think it is probably true. This gets back to something that I kind of like parked when I did the presentation, which was this question of how you would credibly signal that you have automated in the first place. And that, like, obviously you could say that you did, but then it could be like China's no first use strategy. Like, do you believe it? Like, I don't know, like maybe some days, like I believe Taylor, but it's not always, but it's not you would both have to signal verbally, and you would need signals that looked credible, which means that you would have to automate enough that countries would feel like they could verify that through their own like national technical means, essentially, which is, and my suspicion is that that would be hard enough. Like there's probably like a hidden assumption buried here that is hard enough to do effectively that it would make feigning more difficult. And so either you would do it or not do it. But like certainly if you could execute a deception at that level, maybe you could imagine that it wouldn't be the like worst thing in the world, except to Caitlin's point, if it then introduces a counterforce. So like you would need to have the prior to want to do it in the first place, in which case, why wouldn't you follow through? Actually, as I'm like thinking about it, out loud, because otherwise, why would you invite the like counterforce risk at the more at the beginning of a conventional campaign? You wouldn't want to like increase that risk to like just to like bolster deterrence a little bit.
Thanks.
Great. Manish, we were trying to communicate. Would you?
You answered something.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm gonna next pair will be In-Song and Josh. So.
Thank you very much. Barry earlier asked about the thought process behind this respondents. And I was thinking that the responses were given under the assumption that the automated system cannot be turned off. That is, once it is on, is it indefinitely on? But if we perceive the AI as a general purpose technology rather than the artificial super intelligence, by that, I think that what you meant is that Putin can turn off the automation system at some point if he wants. So my question is that what exactly is the assumption made in this paper regarding the feasibility of turning off the system? If it can be turned off, then I don't see what exactly is the theoretical difference between Putin can say that it's gonna launch versus Putin will say that it will be automated and then can be turned off. If it cannot be turned off, that is indefinitely turned on once it is on, then I wonder in which world Putin can credibly commit to forever giving up his ability to turn that back off. So it's at the very theoretical level, something is unclear about the ability of the Putin to be able to turn off the system. So that makes it very difficult whether we're talking about automation or artificial intelligence. And if you can be a little bit clear on that one. Interesting to hear.
Yeah. Hold that thought, Josh.
The logic of pre-deleging AI doesn't seem functionally different from pre-delegating field commanders and airline forces. They get the action is viewed like do the instruction, but it's not irrational for field command forces to protect these units. So if could you elaborate a bit more on if there are functional or hardcore differences between logics? I mean, I can buy that you're purchasing some more credibility by pre-delegating AI as seen in experiments. Are you necessarily purchasing that much more credibility given the risks than these kind of more traditional stuff pre-delegating subordinate numbers?
Good questions. Very quickly, the assumption was that there's no override of the system. We did not give people enough information to allow them to distinguish between if you created this system in the real world outside the confines of this experiment, it certainly would raise the question of whether if you can't turn it off or override it in the moment, what about like 3 months down the road or 6 months down the road or like something like that? Like we frankly did not specify that. And so it is if that was a concern in people's minds, then that would certainly make the results less reliable, I guess. We were not worried about it in this context because we thought that it was unlikely people were going down the rabbit tree that far based on what we know about like how people take experiments and how people like take experiments in general. But I think it's a perfectly reasonable question. And like, frankly, if one was going to try to design one of these systems, that would be I guess you would make it further automatic and set up like a time limit on it or something like that, where like if it hadn't gone off by a certain point, it would like revert back to control or something like that. You would need, because otherwise your hands wouldn't be tied because you could override it, which would defeat the purpose of having the system in the first place, like as your point. To Josh's question about pre-delegation, I mean, in theory, there's no, I mean, if you think that the humans are just as reliable as an algorithm would be, then there is no difference. The reason why people have talked about this possibility is because of the view that humans are unreliable. Humans might be unreliable in this context for two reasons. One, that humans might not like the regime, and so might not, this is the authoritarian worry, and so might not follow like what the leader says. The second is that humans might not wish to start a nuclear war, and so might, for their own reasons, like decide not to launch. Think like a Crimson Tide or like something like kind of situation. And so if you wish to guarantee that escalation happens, like trusting the machine, whether it's a rules-based algorithm or machine learning, like whatever it is, then like becomes more reliable. Like that is the like credibility like delta. How much of a delta that would be? I mean, that's like a great idea for a different experiment. Like that'd be a great follow-up.
So on that note, we should have had pre-delegation of AI to the queue today for better management, because
it's my fault for talking to you.
A number of you have raised your hands and have not gotten to you, for which I apologize, but please join me in thanking Mike for an absolutely perfect talk.